The Intercontinental title has long been considered the workhorse championship of the WWE, the one which all the great in-ring workers want to hold. Yes, over the years we have seen many great moments, matches, and champions, all of which help to give the title the notoriety it has today. But who were the performers that gave the belt its prestige? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into the greatest of them all in Workhorses, the WWE's greatest Intercontinental champions. And if we're going to start anywhere, we really should do so with a man who, in many people's eyes, is still considered to be the greatest Intercontinental champion of all time. That's right, while Hulk Hogan was bringing all the pomp and circumstance to WWF's early 80s main event scene, it was Macho Man Randy Savage who was carrying things in the ring elsewhere. So great was he, in fact, that despite entering the company as a despicable heel in June of 1985, there was always a certain section of the fan base who were willing to pay money to go see him. And so, recognizing this, Vince McMahon didn't waste time in pushing his newest signing when, a few months later, he had him start feuding with Tito Santana, the holder of the secondary strap. But while Santana was good in his own right, he proved to be no match for the Macho Man in the end, and so it was that in February of 1986, in front of a packed crowd at the Boston Garden, the heel was able to get the win and steal the belt away. Sure, he had cheated in order to do so, but that didn't make him any less deserving of being the champion going forward. No, as the weeks and months went on from there, in fact, Savage brought the belt to a level it hadn't really reached before. And that was because, with his technical in-ring skills being far above what was the norm for New York at the time, he was able to regularly steal the show. Seriously, even when he was wrestling older names like Bruno Sammartino and George the Animal Steele, Randy was able to craft matches around them which seemed light years ahead of what anyone else was doing. And it wasn't just in-ring skills which made him stand out either, because with him also being one of the loudest and most colorful characters of the decade, it meant every time he was given a mic and asked to go build up his upcoming match, he did so expertly, usually by cutting a rambling yet somehow evocative promo on his opponent. On top of that, whenever he came down to the ring, he'd do so in such a peacocking manner that every eye in the audience was immediately drawn to him. But then how couldn't they be when he had such extravagant robes and ring gear, the kind which would have made his father's old friend, Gorgeous George, proud? That said, for as memorable as each of these aspects of his personality were, it was always his actual wrestling which stood out the most, and which helped to elevate the Intercontinental title to new levels. And nowhere was this more evident than in the match where he eventually lost the belt to Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. Yes, here, while the focus of the night was supposed to be on the showdown between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, Savage and Steamboat would quietly steal the show with a bout so good, it's still talked about to this day as being amongst the best of all time. Of course, part of the reason it was able to be so good was because, with his habit of planning out matches move for move ahead of time, the champion had a lot of opportunities to fine-tune and perfect things with his opponent before they ever even stepped into the ring that night. But as we mentioned a moment ago, the bout also marked the end of the Macho Man's Intercontinental title run. That said, he went out on such a high level and had such a good run overall that only 1 year later, he'd reached the level of WWF champion after his popularity and talent became too much for Vince McMahon to ignore. But Randy Savage wasn't the only great Intercontinental champion to come out of the 80s. No, while he may have been the only one to later rise to the level of WWF champion, you could certainly make an argument that ravishing Rick Rude would have also been deserving of such an honor based on his run with the secondary belt. Yes, while it may not be as iconic of a run as the Macho Man's, Rick Rude's time as the king of the mid-card was just as impressive. And that's because with him also being an excellent in-ring worker and one capable of acting as the workhorse of the company, he carried the title with all the pride and dignity you'd expect from such a person. And that's even taking into consideration the fact that he was heel too, something which makes it all the more impressive as, well, he usually executed dastardly tactics in order to get the win, he didn't make the belt feel any less valuable and important in doing so. No, this was still very much the period where the IC strap was considered the real top prize by many wrestlers, a badge of honor which meant you were the best of the best if you held it. But where did Rude's reign start specifically? Well, after joining the WWF in 1987 and spending a couple of years challenging the likes of Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Jake the Snake Roberts, the heel began targeting then Intercontinental Champion The Ultimate Warrior at the turn of the decade. Of course, at this time though, most people expected this to be just another opponent for Jim Hellwig to mow through, as by then, his popularity was growing to such highs it was hard to imagine anyone beating him. So that's what made it so shocking when, at WrestleMania 5 in April of 1989, the Ravishing One became the first person to ever hand the Ultimate Warrior a loss in the WWF. And even if he did have to cheat to do so, the result was the same come the end, with this marking arguably the biggest win of the Minnesota Boy's career up until that point. Why was this? Well, after dethroning the next heir apparent to the company, Rude got a chance to show exactly what he could do when he began defending the IC title all around the house show circuit over the next few months, usually main eventing these shows in the process. And of all the opponents he faced at that time, perhaps none were more notable than Rowdy Roddy Piper, someone who gave the heels such a great series of bouts that, when he eventually lost the belt back to the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam in August, he'd be able to segue right over into a TV program with the Canadian. Yes, it wasn't the longest Intercontinental title run, but sometimes quality is more important than quantity. And when it comes to someone like Rick Rude, the quality was always there. But then you'd expect nothing less from a graduate of Verne Gagne. That said, he wasn't the only American Wrestling Association star who ended up traveling over to New York to get a run with their secondary prize. No, only a year later, in fact, it would be his real-life best friend who picked up the mantle once the Warrior vacated the prize, with this figure being none other than Mr. Perfect. Ah, Mr. Perfect. If ever a wrestler was to live up to their name, then it was him. Sure, the gimmick itself was a cartoonish one right in line with the era, as it saw him be introduced through a series of vignettes where he perfected just about every sport under the sun. But even if this was supposed to be over the top, the truth was that Curt Hennig really was that good in the ring. So good, in fact, that by the time he joined the WWF in 1988, he was already one of the most respected performers of his time after having undergone a 53-week reign as AWA's world champion. Of course, that would be far from his peak though, because after signing on the dotted line with Vince McMahon, he'd begin a near 2-year-long win streak. And even when he eventually lost to Brutus the Barber Beefcake at WrestleMania 6, his record would be impressive enough to earn him a spot in the tournament to crown a new Intercontinental Champion following the Ultimate Warrior's relinquishing of the belt. So realizing his moment had come, Hennig put all his perfect skills to good use here as, after going through Jimmy Snuka in the early rounds, he'd find himself facing off against Tito Santana in the finals. And after winning that and now finally having the belt to match his moniker, the former AWA World Champion began proving to everyone just how good he was by going on one of the best runs with the secondary title the company had ever seen at that point. Yes, whether it was the Texas Tornado, the Big Boss Man, or Greg the Hammer Valentine, everyone fell to the champ in the end. And in doing so, they'd usually be taught a thing or two about wrestling too, because with Hennig being near peerless in the ring, he was able to show up each of his opponents in turn. Hell, even when Kerry Von Erich briefly beat him to win the title in late 1990, it wouldn't be long before Perfect won it back again. That said, every king has to face their usurper eventually, and for Curt Hennig, this happened in August 1991 SummerSlam, where he ended up dropping the title to a certain Canadian legend we'll get to more in a moment. That said, the only reason Perfect even lost here was because, by now, his back was so beat up he could barely stand. Not that it stopped him from putting on a 5-star classic here though. No, as it turned out, even when he had an injury bad enough to cripple most men, Hennig was still superhumanly talented. But who was the person who beat him that night to start their own very first reign with the Intercontinental title? Well, that would be our next entry, because while the champ before him may have been perfect, when it came to Bret Hart, he was simply the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Now, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you'll have no doubt heard us gush about how brilliant the Hitman was. And part of the reason he's been able to achieve such a legacy is because, after spending almost a decade with WWF in the 80s quietly working his way up the ranks, mostly in the tag team division, he was more than ready when asked to run with the ball as Intercontinental Champion at the turn of the decade. That's right, with Vince McMahon moving away from big men with glamour muscles at the start of the 90s on account of the looming steroid trial, it meant he needed to find someone else to pick up the slack. And luckily, he had just this person in Bret Hart, because while he may not have been as big as the others, he could out-wrestle anyone he came up against and get a crowd so invested in what he was doing, they were unable to think about anything else. So it was then that after fully stepping into the singles ranks and defeating Mr. Perfect at SummerSlam 1991, the Hitman not only carried on the proud legacy of the IC title being the Workhorse one, but he actually took it to new levels of greatness. And that's because during this run, he'd set the bar for what was expected of in-ring content in New York going forward, with him showing this during his matches against the likes of Skinner. Hell, even when a bad flu caused him to briefly lose the belt to the Mountie in early 1992, it wouldn't be long before Hart won it back again, this time by beating Roddy Piper. And what made that victory all the more special was that it was the first time in WWF history that Piper had ever been pinned. So with such an honor to hang his hat on, the Canadian set about making his second run even more impressive, something he'd do by having show-stealing performance after show-stealing performance against the likes of Shawn Michaels and the British Bulldog. In fact, his match against the latter at SummerSlam 1992 was good enough to merit going on last. And when Bret Hart fell to his brother-in-law here, he managed to create a moment so special it received one of the loudest ovations in wrestling history. Of course, it should go without saying then that once he lost the belt to the Bulldog, it was only a matter of months before the Hitman ascended to the very top of the mountain and became the WWF champion after beating Ric Flair at a house show in October. And he wouldn't have to worry about the legacy of the Intercontinental title going forward at this point either, because following a short reign from Davey Boy Smith, it would be another contender for all-time GOAT who picked up the ball and ran with it. Who are we talking about here? Why, Shawn Michaels, of course. Yes, the icon, the showstopper, the main event. If you polled 100 modern wrestlers and asked them who inspired them to get into the business, we're pretty sure at least half would say Shawn Michaels. But what made him so good? Well, like the yin to his yang, Bret Hart, HBK spent some time in the tag team division during the 80s before eventually working his way up to the singles division. And that meant once the early 90s came, he was more than ready to prove he had what it took, something which was evident in his matches against the likes of Tito Santana and the Hitman himself. Still, despite challenging Hart for the Intercontinental title in the company's first ever ladder match on an episode of Wrestling Challenge in June of 1992, the Heartbreak Kid wasn't able to win the belt quite yet. No, that wouldn't happen until November of the same year, at which point it was the British Bulldog he dethroned. But regardless of who he beat to get there, it didn't matter much in the long run because now with the title around his waist, Michaels was free to reach the next level by defending it against all comers. And this included bouts against a number of opponents, such as his former tag team partner Marty Jannetty, a figure who was briefly able to wrangle the title away from him. Not that Jannetty's reign lasted for a long though, because with a new insurance policy in the form of Diesel by his side, it wasn't long before HBK won back what was rightfully his. That said, as we all know now, 90s Shawn Michaels had a penchant for being something of a prima donna, so anytime he was asked to do a job after this, he always seemed to develop an injury right at the last minute, which prevented him from carrying such an act out. And that was what led to the situation at WrestleMania 10 where, after having vacated the belt without losing it months prior, Michaels returned to face off against then-champion Razor Ramon in a ladder match. That's right, this was the one which changed the game forever and sparked a million imitators over the years. But even if teams like the Hardy Boys, the Dudley Boys, and Edge and Christian would later take it to new levels, you could still argue the gimmick was never better than it was here on its first pay-per-view appearance. So good was it, in fact, it would be done again at SummerSlam 1995 with the Heartbreak Kid this time coming out the winner. Of course, that was a shorter run overall, as by then, like both Bret Hart and Randy Savage before him, Shawn Michaels' time as Intercontinental Champion had allowed him to shine so much that he would be WWF Champion soon enough. But not every IC champ goes on to be the World Champ. No, sometimes they remain at the same level. Not that this makes their time with the belt itself any less successful though, quite the opposite in fact, as can be seen in the case of the Honky Tonk Man. Yeah, we can hear you asking the question already, how can you consider the Honky Tonk Man to be in the same category as Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart? Well, while these two performers certainly had a better career in the long run, when it came to their time with the Intercontinental strap specifically, you could argue that they were both outshone by Wayne Ferris. Why is this? Because even if the two faces of the new generation held the belt multiple times over, neither of them held it for as long as the Tennessee native. No one did. And that's why, to this day, he's still ranked as the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. That's right, from June 13th, 1987, when he defeated Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, all the way up until August 29th, 1998, when he was finally dethroned by the Ultimate Warrior, no one was able to beat the secondary champion. And sure, more often than not, he defended the belt through screwy means, but come on, he was a heel, what'd you expect him to do? The thing is, the Honky Tonk Man is a perfect example of someone who was never meant to get such a prominent spot, but took the ball and ran with it so much that he ended up turning it into something career-defining when the opportunity fell in his path. Basically, it happened when it became clear Ricky Steamboat was going to be taking some time off around mid-1987, and Vince McMahon was left with a conundrum as it would be taking the Intercontinental belt from him. After all, the boss had already made plans for the Dragon to have a lengthy run, so when he learned of the notorious family man's plans to spend a period away from the ring with his wife and child, he hadn't yet built up anyone to take his place. Luckily then, while backstage one night, Hulk Hogan pointed out the Honky Tonk Man to the boss, telling him that he was impressed with what he'd seen from him so far, and that he felt like he'd make a good champ going forward. And what a smart decision that turned out to be then, because after being booked to win the title from Steamboat soon thereafter, Wayne Ferris began a record 454-day reign which, to this day, 3.5 decades on, is still yet to be beaten. Sure, unlike some of the other performers discussed in this video, the Honky Tonk Man's forte was never exactly his skills in the ring, and so because of this, his matches didn't always meet up with the legacy the title had earned by then. But even if he wasn't able to keep up in the ring as the workhorse of the promotion, he was able to get such nuclear heat from fans everywhere he went that barely anyone noticed any of his shortcomings anyway. No, all they wanted was for someone to beat him to a pulp, with this being what drew crowds in to watch each and every one of his matches. That said, no matter how hard the babyfaces tried, they'd always end up getting outsmarted by the champ come the end, with this only building the anticipation for his eventual defeat that much more. So when he finally came up against an unstoppable force in the form of the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam 1998 then, it was a euphoric moment as fans at last got to see the dastardly heel fall in the most embarrassing fashion when he was pinned in just 31 seconds. Not that this would harm his legacy in the long run though, because with him still being the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion in history, this meant his name has continued to live on as arguably the greatest ever in the years since. In fact, the length of his reign has occasionally even been used in storylines over the years, with Santino Marella's Honkameter being a prime example of this. But while Santino did an admirable job of trying to revive the legacy of the Intercontinental Championship during its darkest days in the late 2000s and onwards, even he wasn't able to make it feel important again. No, you could argue that during that decade-and-a-half long period, only 2 men were able to give it any prestige at all, the first of which was The Miz. Yes, despite often being derided by hardcore fans as the prime example of everything that's wrong with the WWE in-house style, Mike Mizanin has managed to have a more lengthy and successful career in the ring than almost any of his peers. And a big part of the reason he's been able to achieve such heights is because of his ability to be slotted into whatever position the company demands of him at any given time. It doesn't matter if it's a lower card comedy spot, one half of a tag team, or the WrestleMania main event. The Miz is just as dependable either way. And that's meant over the course of his near 2 decades long run on the roster, he'd held the Intercontinental strap a total of 8 times. In fact, during an era where the secondary belt never felt less important, Mizanin managed to give it some sense of importance by largely making it his throughout the late 2000s and into the 2010s. And this meant that whenever he was asked to do a public speaking event and represent the company to its fullest, he was always ready, willing, and able to carry this out with the title around his waist. But that shouldn't suggest he didn't also have some great matches throughout his 8 runs with the belt, of course. No, he'd actually stole the show on more than one occasion, while going up against opponents such as Dolph Ziggler, Seth Rollins, and Sami Zayn, just to name a few. And even after he won the WWE title and main evented WrestleMania 27, he still wasn't above returning to the mid-card division, using his new superstar powers to help keep the belt elevated above the waterline during a time when it needed it the most. That said, for as great a representative as The Miz has been for the division during a time when few people seem to care about it anymore, he still isn't the best IC champion of the 21st century. And that's because, despite his 8 title reigns putting him over the top, there's another former WWE champion who's had even more. That's right, as a 9-time IC champ, Chris Jericho holds the record for the most reigns overall. Of course, nowadays, Y2J is working in All Elite Wrestling, where, after serving as their first ever world champion, he's now helping to get the next generation over by working alongside names such as Sammy Guevara, MJF, and Ricky Starks. Before he reached this twilight run, though, his main success had come in WWE, where over a period of 20 years, he won just about every belt the company had to offer. But while multiple world titles and tag team titles came his way over the decades, it was probably the Intercontinental strap which he became most closely identified with. And that's partially because it was the first one he won back in 1999, only a few months after he joined with the company when, for a time, he became a co-holder with China. Then, once that reign was over, he ended up winning it back multiple times over the next few years as he got to showcase the belt in matches against the likes of Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, and Eddie Guerrero. Yes, outside of the golden era of the 80s, this might have been the period where the status of the secondary prize was higher than it ever had been. But as time went on, Jericho began to focus less and less on the ring and more on outside endeavors such as his band Fozzy. And perhaps as a consequence of this then, the IC belt also dropped in importance too, pretty much becoming an afterthought which was rarely even defended in big matches anymore. So luckily, whenever Jericho did return, he'd always make time to lift the title he once held so dearly back up again. Even when he could have been in the world title picture, in fact, the Canadian kept finding himself being drawn back to the division, as by the time it got to 2009, he'd have won it for a record 9th time. Hell, so synonymous had he become with the Intercontinental title picture by this point, when a fan poll was held by WWE in 2013, he gained 63% of the votes to be named the greatest of all its former holders. Still though, for as much as Le Champion raised the bar for what an IC champ could be in many ways, he's not the biggest star to ever have a notable run with the belt. No, this is an honor which can only be given to one man, arguably the biggest star in all of Hollywood, and that's The Rock. Yes, the People's Champion, the Great One, and the King of the Box Office may be better known today as the star of franchises like Jumanji and The Fast and the Furious, but back in the late 90s, he was just an up-and-coming wrestler struggling to get over with fans. And that's because with him being presented as the whitest meat babyface imaginable, it was hard for him to get people on his side during an era where Steve Austin was the coolest guy out there. So during his initial run with the Intercontinental title in February of 1997, it's no surprise that the NOIE family member was roundly rejected by live crowds everywhere. Thankfully though, this would change when later that year, Dwayne Johnson found his personality and morphed into the cocky villain who could out-trash talk anyone on the mic, then back up those words once inside the squared circle. Sure, it did help that he had some amazing dance partners to work with during this year and the year which followed on from that, with the names he faced off against there, including the likes of Triple H, Ken Shamrock, and of course, Steve Austin himself. That said, none of this should make what the Great One achieved feel any less important because, quite simply, he was so talented and got so over in such a short space of time that within 2 years, he went from getting nuclear go-away heat on a regular basis to becoming a world champion and bona fide main eventer. Would he have gotten to this point without having his run as Intercontinental Champion? Probably. But it certainly didn't hurt his case that during the time when WWF was exploding into the mainstream, he was right there front and center, often stealing the show out from under others as he made the secondary strap feel just as important as the top one at times. Yes, you can take his ladder match at SummerSlam 1998 and place it right there amongst the best title bouts of the era. In many ways, in fact, you could argue that Dwayne Johnson's run with the strap was the last one of its classic era, as after he dropped it, no one else was really able to meet his standards. And partially because of that then, it would begin to fall in importance as a result, with it no longer being saved for folks on the verge of breaking out into the main event scene. And that's a shame because it didn't have to be this way. No, it could still have kept the same aura around it had it been booked correctly. Even during the mid-90s, when WWF had less star power than ever, they were able to make the IC title feel important by the way they treated it. And if you're looking for one single champ who defined the belt more than anyone else in the 90s, that's the point we have to go back to, because you could argue that it isn't, in fact, The Rock who takes this spot. Hell, you could even argue that it's not Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels either, because while each of those figures later went on to find greater success as a world champion, no one held down the fort for the mid-card division and stayed there as its anchor during the New Generation era, quite like Razor Ramon did. And the reason for this is because few, if any, ever looked cooler with it around their waists. Of course, Ramon was always dripping in gold wherever he went anyway, and so it's no surprise that an extra piece in the form of a championship would only add to his swagger. But how did he come to win it for the first time? Well, to answer that, we have to travel all the way back to 1993, as it was there that, after spending a year familiarizing audiences with his new character, Scott Hall finally got a chance to reach the next level. Unfortunately for him at the time though, when he won the IC belt, it would not be by beating the champion directly, as Shawn Michaels had vacated it a few weeks prior. That said, any doubts about who the real champion was were soon rectified when, at the WrestleMania 10 ladder match between the two we spoke about earlier, it was the bad guy who came out on top. So with his claim now being undisputed and with one of the greatest bouts of all time under his belt, he carried on as he had started by being better and cooler than anyone else around him. In fact, even when he lost the title to his clique buddy Diesel later on in the year, it didn't keep Ramon down for long, because by SummerSlam, he'd have won it right back again. And when the same happened against Jeff Jarrett in January of 1995, the bad guy didn't sweat it for a second, with this largely being the reason why, come May of that same year, he'd be a 3-time champion. Of course, at this point in history then, it made him the person with the most IC title reigns ever. And given the fact that he'd never get to rise to that main event level under Vince McMahon's watch, it also meant he'd become something of a measuring stick for the division from there, someone who everyone had to go through eventually if they wanted to prove themselves. Seriously, by the end of his time with WWF in 1996, he'd have won the belt on 4 separate occasions, making him a strong contender for greatest IC champ of all time. But then, anyone we've discussed today could also make a claim for this title too, as in their own ways, they've each helped to make it what it is, either by elevating it to new heights or just by keeping it afloat during its darkest times. And it's not as if the story of this particular belt is over yet. No, far from it, because with Gunther now bringing it back to some of its past prominence, there's every possibility he'll end up on a list like this someday too. And once he's finished doing his job and reviving the title, who knows what other young up-and-coming stars might sweep in and win it next. What we do know is that in doing so, they'll have to work hard to prove themselves as modern-day workhorses and people who can always be counted on to carry the weight of both the division and its long and storied history on their shoulders.